The night was dark, and the small street in the impoverished neighborhood lay shrouded in shadows. The only light came from flickering street lamps, as if they too had grown weary after a long day. The faint sound of stray cats clawing at trash bins mingled with the whistling wind that cut through the cracks in old walls. The wet pavement glistened with puddles reflecting the faint glow of the night sky. Jerome, a black man in his early 30s, trudged along the deserted street. He wore a faded old coat, and his scuffed shoes showed signs of wear. His tall, broad frame slouched slightly, betraying the exhaustion of a long day of grueling labor at the docks. His breath formed pale puffs of mist in the chilly air. In his hand, he carried a bag of cheap groceries from a nearby corner store, carefully budgeting every penny for the tough days ahead. As he reached the corner, Jerome froze. Under the dim glow of a street lamp, he saw a man lying motionless on the sidewalk. The man was dressed in an expensive suit, now wrinkled and soiled. His pale face glistened with sweat, and his body appeared lifeless. Jerome approached cautiously, squinting to get a better look. "Are you okay?" Jerome rasped, his voice hoarse as he gently shook the man's shoulder. There was no response. The man let out a faint groan, his eyes fluttering open slightly but unable to focus. It was clear to Jerome that he was in terrible shape. He set his grocery bag down and bent to check the man's breathing. Though not a doctor, he could tell that without help, the man wouldn't make it. "Damn it, I can't just leave him here," Jerome muttered, drawing on his strength from years of hauling heavy loads. Jerome carefully hoisted the man onto his shoulders. Even though he was drained from the day's work, he pressed on, navigating through the maze of narrow alleys to his modest home. Each step was a struggle, but Jerome didn't falter. "Just a little farther," he whispered to himself, inhaling deeply to summon his strength. Jerome lived in a cramped room in an old rickety building with creaky wooden stairs. His space was just big enough for a single bed, a small wooden table, and a few basic belongings. The ceiling was stained yellow with age, and peeling paint revealed dull gray bricks underneath. Despite its run-down appearance, the room exuded a sense of warmth, thanks to Jerome's meticulous care. He gently laid the man on the bed. From a corner of the room, Jerome grabbed an old towel, dampened it with warm water, and wiped the sweat from the man's face. Placing a hand on the man's forehead, he noticed the high fever, likely from exhaustion or illness. "I don't know who you are, but you've got to wake up," Jerome murmured, setting a glass of water on the table beside the bed. The man gasped for air, his dry lips parting slightly. His eyes fluttered open and adjusted to the dim light in the room. Seeing Jerome, his expression was one of confusion. His voice was weak and hoarse. "Where am I?" Jerome pulled up a chair next to the bed, observing the stranger. The man had the bearing of someone accustomed to power-sharp features, and graying hair neatly trimmed, though his current disheveled state made him look like someone who had just fought a losing battle. "You're in my home," Jerome replied simply. "I found you on the street. Couldn't just leave you there." The man looked around the small room, clearly unaccustomed to such modest surroundings. He tried to sit up, but dizziness sent him collapsing back onto the bed. Jerome steadied him quickly. "Take it easy. You need rest. Here, drink this." Jerome offered the glass of water. The man took it with trembling hands. After a few sips, his voice grew steadier. "Thank you, but why are you helping me? You don't even know who I am." Jerome shrugged, a faint smile crossing his face. "True, I don't, but that doesn't matter. Everyone needs help sometimes." Jerome's words left the man silent. He looked at Jerome with a mix of gratitude and skepticism. The man tried to piece together what had happened. He was Edward Coleman, a billionaire known for his business acumen. But recent months had been chaotic. Lawsuits, tense board meetings, betrayals by those he trusted, it had all driven him to the brink. In a moment of despair, he had abandoned everything and wandered to this neighborhood, thinking no one would find him here. Edward found it hard to believe that someone like Jerome, a total stranger, would help without expecting anything in return. He sighed, glancing at Jerome. "I didn't think there were still good people like you in this world." Jerome chuckled softly. "Maybe you live in a different world than I do. Around here, we don't have much, but we share what we can." Edward remained quiet, struck by the simple yet profound truth in Jerome's words. Jerome left the room to prepare some food. Alone, Edward took in the humble surroundings. To his surprise, he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace, something he hadn't experienced in years. On the table beside the bed, an old photograph caught Edward's eye. In it, Jerome stood with a young woman and a little boy, all three smiling brightly. Though faded with time, the photo radiated the warmth of a happy family. Edward mused, "This man seems to have more stories than his rugged exterior reveals." When Jerome returned with a bowl of hot soup, he placed it on the table and said, "Eat up, you'll need your strength to tell me your story." Edward was taken aback, but then broke into a laugh. It had been a long time since someone had shown genuine concern for him without seeking money or fame. In that small, weathered room, a quiet warmth settled between two people from vastly different worlds. As they shared their first connection on a cold night, the faint morning light seeped through the small window, casting soft rays into Jerome's modest room. The space was quiet except for the wind whistling through the cracks in the door, and the gentle clatter from the tiny kitchen, where Jerome was boiling water. The light aroma of coffee mingled with the damp but familiar air of the poor neighborhood. Edward, the man Jerome had rescued, slowly regained consciousness. His body still felt heavy with exhaustion, but he sensed a warmth and safety he hadn't felt in a long time. His face scrunched as the light hit his eyes. Slowly, his ash-gray eyes opened, scanning the unfamiliar room with confusion. The wall in front of him was peeling, exposing old gray bricks. In the corner stood a wooden chair with a broken leg propped against the wall. Beside it was a small table holding a few worn books and a faded family photo. Everything in the room spoke of poverty but not disorder. Edward shifted slightly, his body still weak. The creak of the wooden door drew his attention as Jerome entered, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Dressed in a faded t-shirt and worn jeans, Jerome looked weathered but carried a calm simplicity. "Jerome, you're awake. How are you feeling?" Edward furrowed his brows, his voice hoarse. "Edward, where am I?" "Jerome, you're in my home. You collapsed on the street last night. I couldn't leave you there, so I brought you here." Edward looked at Jerome, his gaze filled with confusion and a hint of suspicion. He tried to sit up but was overcome by dizziness, falling back onto the thin pillow. "Edward, I can't remember much. I just know I walked for a long time, and then suddenly." Jerome set the cup of coffee on the table and sat on the chair across from Edward. "Jerome, you probably overexerted yourself. Judging by your clothes, I'd say you're not from around here. Why were you wandering this far?" Edward shook his head, avoiding a direct answer. "Edward, I don't know. I just wanted to go somewhere far away from everything." Jerome studied him for a moment but didn't press further. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. Standing up, Jerome poured more water into the old kettle on the stove and spoke. "Jerome, drink something warm, you'll feel better." Edward accepted the coffee Jerome offered, his hands still trembling. The warmth of the cup spread through his skin, and he realized he hadn't felt this kind of comfort in a long time. He looked at Jerome, a man he knew nothing about, except for the kindness evident in his every action. "Edward, why are you helping me? You don't know who I am, and I have nothing to give you in return." Jerome shrugged, holding his own coffee cup, his expression unbothered. "Jerome, I don't need to know who you are. Around here, we help each other because it's the right thing to do. If I were lying out there, I'd hope someone would do the same for me." Edward fell silent, his gaze wandering across the humble room. He couldn't understand how someone living in such hardship could be so generous. "Edward, this place is so different from my world." Jerome sat back in his chair, leaning against it. A faint smile touched his lips, though his eyes carried traces of fatigue. "Jerome, your world must be the world of the wealthy, huh? We may live in different places, but we're all human. We need each other to survive." Jerome's simple words struck Edward. They carried a profound truth he had never considered before. While Jerome stepped out to prepare some food, Edward lay on the bed, his eyes drawn to the family photo on the worn table. In it, Jerome stood beside a young woman and a little boy, all three of them beaming with joy. Though faded with age, the photo radiated the warmth of a happy family. Edward thought to himself, "This man, he's clearly had a family, so why is he here alone?" He continued to observe the room. Everything was neatly arranged, from the old books to the carefully folded towel on the chair. Despite the poverty, Jerome maintained a sense of order and dignity in his life. The sound of activity in the small kitchen pulled Edward from his thoughts. Jerome returned, carrying a steaming bowl of soup, which he placed on the table beside the bed. "Jerome, I don't have much, but this will help you feel better." Edward sat up, this time without the dizziness. He looked at Jerome, his eyes reflecting genuine gratitude. "Edward, Thank you. Not everyone would do this for a stranger. Jerome smiled lightly, pulling up the chair again. Jerome, life isn't easy, but if we don't help each other, what else do we have but loneliness? Edward stirred the soup with a spoon, the warmth of the gesture resonating deeply. For the first time in years, he felt a rare sense of comfort coming from an unexpected source, the unconditional kindness of a stranger. They sat there in the cramped room, exchanging stories. Jerome spoke of his life in the poor neighborhood, of neighbors who, despite their struggles, always shared what little they had with one another. Edward listened intently, occasionally nodding or asking questions. He was surprised at how drawn he was to the simple tales of Jerome's life, so different from the corporate world he once dominated. Edward, how long have you lived here? Jerome, since I was a kid. This is home. No matter how hard things get, I can't leave. What about you? Why did you leave your world? Edward hesitated, his eyes shifting away. Edward, I just needed to get away from everything. Life sometimes, it's too much. Jerome nodded, asking no further questions. In his eyes, Edward saw understanding, but no judgment. The room fell quiet again. Edward placed the half-empty bowl of soup on the table, feeling his strength returning. Edward, thank you, Jerome. I owe you a great debt. Jerome chuckled softly, standing to tidy up. Jerome, you don't owe me anything. But if you want, you can help someone else when they need it. That's enough. Edward gazed at Jerome, saying nothing more. He wondered if the man's kindness was a gift or a reminder of what life was truly about. The morning unfolded in quiet serenity as sunlight filtered through the leaves of a tree outside, casting soft beams into Jerome's small room. The air carried the lingering aroma of freshly cooked soup mixed with the faint scent of coffee from earlier. Edward sat propped against the headboard, his gaze wandering idly through the small window. From the kitchen, Jerome emerged, carrying a plate of old bread and a few simple fried eggs. He placed the plate on the small table by the bed and sat down in the chair across from Edward. Jerome, I don't have the kind of lavish breakfast you might be used to, but it'll fill you up. Edward glanced at the food. Simple as it was, the aroma of the fried eggs made his stomach growl. He picked up a piece of bread, took a bite, and looked at Jerome. Edward, it's better than I expected. Jerome shrugged with a light smile. Jerome, food doesn't need to be fancy, just cooked with care. Edward didn't respond, but a strange feeling stirred within him. It had been a long time since he'd tasted a humble meal prepared by someone who genuinely cared. The atmosphere between them grew more relaxed. Jerome leaned back in his chair, his calm gaze resting on Edward as he ate. After a while, Jerome broke the silence. Jerome, you still haven't told me. What's a man like you doing here, wandering the streets in the middle of the night? Edward paused, setting the bread down with a faint sigh. He could tell Jerome wasn't prying, but was genuinely concerned. Edward, I don't want to burden you with my story. Jerome smiled, folding his arms. Jerome, if you feel that way, think of it as a way to lighten your own burden. Edward hesitated, the weight of his thoughts evident in his silence. After a moment, he spoke, his voice lower than before. Edward, I used to be a man who had everything. Money, power, status. But then I realized those things didn't mean much when everyone around me turned their back on me. I was betrayed by the people I trusted the most. Backed into a corner, I didn't know what else to do, so I left. Jerome listened intently, not interrupting. He looked at Edward not with pity, but with quiet understanding. Jerome, sounds like you lost everything. Edward let out a bitter chuckle. Edward, no, not everything. I still have money, but now I see that money is useless when your heart feels empty. Edward's words struck a chord with Jerome, who leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. Jerome, what were you hoping to find by wandering into this neighborhood? Edward replied softly, almost to himself. Edward, I don't know. Maybe. I was looking for a place where no one knew who I was. Somewhere I could escape everything, even for a little while. Jerome nodded without pressing further. He could sense that Edward carried a burden too deep for words to fully convey, one that only time might heal. After a moment, Jerome shifted the conversation. Leaning back in his chair, he looked up at the ceiling. Jerome, I had a dream once, too, like you, but mine wasn't so grand. Edward tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. Edward, what kind of dream? Jerome smiled faintly, though his eyes held a trace of sadness. Jerome, when I was younger, I thought I could leave this place behind. I wanted to build a better life for my family, my wife and my son. But then, his voice trailed off, as if he were reluctant to revisit the memories. Edward waited quietly, not pushing for more. Jerome, my wife passed away from an illness. She couldn't get treatment in time because we couldn't afford it. After that, my son went to live with his grandparents. I didn't want him growing up in poverty like me, so I let him go. Jerome's words left Edward deeply moved. He didn't know what to say and could only sit in silence, sharing the weight of the other man's pain. Jerome, I stayed here, kept working, kept living. But one thing I remind myself every day is this: no matter what life throws at me, I can't lose my kindness. Because if I lose that, I lose everything. Edward sat quietly, his hand tightening slightly around the empty cup. He looked at Jerome, a man who seemed so strong yet carried such profound sorrow within him. Edward, you've held on to your kindness, even after everything that's happened to you. Jerome smiled gently and nodded. Jerome, I'm not rich like you, but I have something money can't buy, a heart that doesn't break. Jerome's words echoed in Edward's mind. He couldn't deny the strength he saw in Jerome, something he'd never encountered among the powerful and wealthy people he had always known. Edward thought to himself, this man, he's living proof that money isn't everything. The morning passed with a quiet ease. Jerome stood to clear the table while Edward remained seated, lost in thought about all he'd just heard. Jerome returned and placed a hand on Edward's shoulder. Jerome, get some more rest. You're not fully recovered yet. Edward nodded, offering a faint smile. Edward, thank you. Jerome, I don't know what to say, but I'm grateful. Jerome smiled back and left the room, leaving Edward alone with his thoughts. As the sunlight outside grew brighter, Edward began to feel that perhaps this small, humble room was exactly where he needed to be to find himself again. The afternoon sunlight bathed the small street in a soft golden hue. Children laughed and chased an old ball along the sidewalk, their voices ringing through the air, filling the impoverished neighborhood with vibrant energy. From the window of Jerome's modest room, Edward quietly observed the scene. This place was nothing like the opulent world he had known. There were no luxury cars or towering skyscrapers. Yet there was a sense of connection here that he had never experienced before. Jerome entered the room, carrying an old coat. He smiled as he looked at Edward. Jerome, feeling better? If you're up to it, I'll take you on a walk around the neighborhood. There's not much to see, but I think you should meet the people here. Edward hesitated, but eventually nodded. He put on the coat Jerome handed him, and followed him outside at a slow pace. They walked along a bumpy road lined with crumbling houses. The walls were cracked, and the roofs sagged, yet smoke curling from some chimneys hinted at simple meals being prepared inside. Jerome gestured toward a small house at the corner of the street. Jerome, that's Alice's house. She's lived alone since her husband passed. Even though she's over 70, she still knits and sells her work to get by. Edward followed Jerome's gaze and saw an elderly woman sitting by the window, her nimble hands moving expertly with the knitting needles. The gentle smile on her wrinkled face stirred something deep within Edward. Edward, why isn't she getting support from someone? The government, perhaps. Jerome shrugged. Jerome, support. Around here, if we don't help ourselves, no one else will. But Alice never complains. She always says, to live another day is a blessing. Edward felt a quiet resilience in these people, something he had never encountered among the wealthy individuals he once surrounded himself with. Jerome led Edward further down the street to a group of men working on an old truck. They laughed and teased each other as they toiled, their camaraderie evident in their easy banter. One of the men, tall and muscular, spotted Jerome, and waved. Neighbor, hey Jerome, home early today. Jerome grinned and called back. Jerome, yeah, I've got a new friend with me. He's staying here for a few days. Edward was taken aback by Jerome's introduction. There was no mention of their differences, just a simple new friend. He shook hands with the man, feeling the warmth and sincerity in his grip. Finally, Jerome brought Edward to an old school building at the end of the street. The structure was dilapidated, with peeling paint, broken windows, and wild grass overtaking the yard. On the main wall, a faded inscription read, "Hope is a light that never goes out." Edward stopped and took in the scene. The silence surrounding the building felt heavy, as if it had once held great significance, but was now overshadowed by neglect. Jerome stood beside him, his eyes filled with nostalgia. Jerome, this was my school. I have so many memories here. But it closed down when the neighborhood couldn't afford to keep it running. Edward looked at Jerome, noticing the sadness etched in his face. Jerome, I always dreamed of seeing this place open again. The kids here deserve a space to learn, to dream." But Jerome trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Edward understood Jerome's dream had been stifled by the harsh realities of poverty. Edward walked slowly across the overgrown yard, feeling the softness of the grass under his shoes. He placed his hand on the cracked wall, his expression contemplative. "Edward, you've never thought about leaving this place? Moving somewhere with more opportunities?" Jerome shook his head. "Jerome, this is home. If I leave, we'll stay to do the little things that matter." Jerome's response left Edward speechless. He realized Jerome wasn't just a resilient man, he was the heart of this community. On their walk back, the two men moved at an easy pace, each lost in their own thoughts. After a while, Edward broke the silence. "Edward, you're right, we do need each other to survive. But sometimes, I wonder if there are enough people like you in the world." Jerome chuckled, a glimmer of humor in his eyes. "Jerome, they're out there, my friend. You just won't see them on the news or TV. They're in places like this, quietly making small but meaningful changes." Edward nodded, a sense of calm settling over him. He began to feel that this unexpected journey might be a turning point in his life. When they returned to Jerome's small room, Jerome gestured toward the table. "Jerome, now, it's your turn to tell me your story." Edward offered a faint smile, though he knew his story wouldn't be easy to share. Yet he felt that Jerome, with his kindness and willingness to listen, might be the first person he truly wanted to open up to. As the afternoon faded, the soft golden-orange light of sunset cast a gentle glow over the neighborhood. Jerome and Edward stood before an old playground, once the only recreational space for the children in the area. Rusty swings creaked in the breeze, a bent and wobbly slide leaned precariously to one side, and a wooden bench, nearly broken, sat forgotten at the edge. Despite its rundown state, the place held echoes of laughter that still lingered in the air. A group of 5 or 6 children played with a battered plastic ball in the yard. Their joyous laughter rang out, breaking the silence of the surroundings. Jerome folded his arms, a warm smile lighting his face as he watched. "Jerome, this is the only place for them to play. They don't have much, but I think they're happier than we realize." Edward stood beside him, taking in the scene. A small boy, no older than 6, clumsily chased after the ball. His clothes were worn, and his shoes were barely held together, but the smile on his face was radiant, infectious even. "Edward, I don't understand how they can laugh like that in these conditions." Jerome turned to him, his smile tinged with sadness. "Jerome, when you have nothing, you learn to appreciate the little things. That's how we live." Jerome sat down on the wobbly bench and patted the spot next to him, inviting Edward to join. The breeze carried the sound of children's laughter as they sat in silence for a moment. "Jerome, I used to play here when I was a kid. Same old ball, same rusty swings. Back then, none of us cared. As long as we had friends and laughter, it was enough." Edward turned to look at Jerome, and saw a mixture of nostalgia and regret in his expression. Jerome continued, his voice quieter now. "Jerome, as I grew up, I realized this neighborhood had no opportunities, no good schools, no steady jobs. Most kids here drop out early to help their families. I didn't want that for my son. That's why I let him go." Edward said nothing, sensing the depth of Jerome's pain. He didn't need to ask more about Jerome's son. The unspoken weight was evident. "Jerome, but that doesn't mean I've given up on this place. I still believe that if we're given a chance, even the smallest chance, we can turn things around." Edward studied Jerome, feeling a deep admiration for the man beside him. Jerome wasn't rich or powerful, yet his resilience and love for his community shone brighter than anything Edward had seen in his own privileged world. "Edward, Jerome, have you ever thought that maybe your dreams are too big? That you can't do it alone?" Jerome chuckled softly and nodded. "Jerome, of course. But if I don't dream, who will? And if I don't start, who will?" Jerome's words left Edward stunned. A man who once prided himself on being practical, Edward now realized that his practicality had robbed him of faith in good, meaningful pursuits. He looked at the children, still laughing and playing, then back at Jerome. An idea began to form in his mind. That night, Edward lay on the small bed in Jerome's room, staring at the ceiling. Sleep eluded him as images flooded his thoughts. The children's smiles, Jerome's unwavering hope, and the dilapidated playground that seemed to embody the struggles of the entire neighborhood. He thought back to his own past, the early days of his career, when he was full of big dreams about changing the world. Over time, those dreams had been replaced by numbers in bank accounts, towering skyscrapers, and power plays. He wondered what he had lost along the way. Edward to himself, maybe this is my chance to start over, but do I have the courage to begin? The next morning, as Jerome prepared breakfast, Edward walked into the kitchen. He had spent the entire night thinking, and his decision was clear. Edward, Jerome, you're right. Everything starts with a dream. But sometimes, to make a dream come true, you need help. Jerome paused, turning to face Edward, a slight frown of curiosity crossing his face. Jerome, what do you mean? Edward sat down at the small table, his voice calm but filled with determination. Edward, I want to help you. I want to make your dreams a reality, the playground, the school, all of it. But I need you to show me how. Jerome stared at Edward, his eyes narrowing with skepticism. Jerome, do you really think you can help? You have no idea how hard life is here. Edward smiled faintly. Edward, I don't, but I'm willing to learn. You've taught me so much in just a few days. Now, let me repay the favor. Jerome remained silent for a long moment, considering Edward's offer. Finally he nodded, a small smile breaking across his face. Jerome, if you're serious, then fine, but I'm not going to go easy on you. Edward laughed, a sound that felt strangely foreign yet freeing. Edward, I wouldn't expect anything less. The scene ended with Jerome and Edward sitting across from each other in the tiny kitchen, beginning to map out their plans for transforming the neighborhood. Hope flickered to life, not just in Jerome's eyes but also in Edward's heart of heart, that was slowly rediscovering the joy of living for something greater than himself. The quiet night was pierced by the faint glow of dim yellow streetlights flickering over the narrow road. In a corner of the neighborhood, Jerome and Edward worked alongside a group of neighbors to clean up the old schoolyard. The sounds of shovels digging into dirt and occasional bursts of laughter punctuated the serene atmosphere. Every eye sparkled with a shared hope for a brighter future. Edward, wearing one of Jerome's old t-shirts, carefully picked up shards of broken glass from the shattered windows. Every so often, he glanced around, watching others work with an energy and joy that felt both foreign and strangely comforting to him. Jerome, you're doing great, Edward. I didn't think a billionaire would be this good at manual labor. Edward laughed, his breath heavy with exertion. Edward, I used to think my work was hard, but now I see it's the hands that do this kind of work that truly build the world. Jerome smiled and nodded in agreement. The peace was short-lived. A loud, angry shout rang out from down the street, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Jerome turned, his face immediately tense. Doug, hey, you lazy fools, what do you think you're doing? A group of 4 men appeared, led by a tall, broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut. He wore a leather jacket, and tattoos of snarling beasts covered his forearms. It was Lucas, a notorious loan shark who ruled the neighborhood with fear, someone everyone avoided at all costs. Lucas, this is my turf. Who gave you permission to mess with it? Jerome stepped forward, his expression calm but resolute. Jerome. Lucas, this is an abandoned schoolyard. It doesn't belong to anyone. Lucas smirked and walked closer, stopping inches away from Jerome. His voice was low and menacing. Lucas, wrong. Everything here belongs to me. I run this place. If you want to do anything, you need my permission. Edward, standing a few steps back, clenched his fists. He'd never encountered someone like Lucas before, but he could sense the danger in every movement the man made. Jerome didn't flinch. His steady gaze locked onto Lucas as he replied in a slow, firm voice. Jerome, we're just trying to improve the neighborhood. Lucas, this has nothing to do with you. Lucas let out a cold, mocking laugh, his voice echoing in the stillness. Lucas, improve. Who do you think you are? Jerome, some kind of hero? Or do you want to fill these kids' heads with useless dreams, just so they end up in the same trap as the rest of us? Jerome stayed silent, but his eyes hardened. He knew Lucas was trying to intimidate everyone, and he couldn't let that happen. Edward took a step forward, but Jerome raised a hand, signaling him to stop. He understood that Lucas wouldn't back down with words alone, but Jerome also refused to resort to violence. Jerome, Lucas, we don't want any trouble. If you don't want to help, that's fine. Just let us do our work. Lucas narrowed his eyes, as though weighing his options. After a tense moment, he burst into laughter again, the sound cold and grating. Lucas, fine, but I'll be watching you. Don't give me a reason to step in. As Lucas turned to leave, he added a final warning. Lucas, and remember, Jerome, I'm always here, waiting to see you fail. The group watched as Lucas and his men disappeared into the shadows. The air remained heavy with tension. A few neighbors exchanged nervous glances, their worry written plainly on their faces. An elderly woman finally spoke up, her voice trembling. "Neighbor, Jerome, maybe we should stop. Lucas isn't someone to mess with." Jerome turned to the group, his eyes softening. "Jerome, I know he's dangerous, but if we stop now, nothing will ever change. We've lived in fear long enough. It's time to do what's right." Edward stepped up beside Jerome, his voice steady and determined. "Edward, Jerome's right. Lucas only has power because we're afraid. If we stand together, there's nothing he can do." The group fell silent, surprised by Edward's words. Slowly, their expressions shifted from fear to quiet resolve. "Neighbor, all right, Jerome, we're with you." Jerome smiled, nodding in gratitude. He knew this was only the beginning of a long battle, but the support of the community was the most valuable weapon he could have. As the group returned to their work, Edward watched Jerome move among them, offering encouragement and guidance. He realized that Jerome wasn't just an ordinary man, he was the heart and soul of this neighborhood. Edward approached Jerome and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Edward, you've done something I never could. Jerome, you've made people believe, even when the odds are against them." Jerome chuckled lightly, a hint of humor in his eyes. "Jerome, that's because I don't have any other choice. If I don't believe, who will?" Edward laughed as well. Though the words sounded simple, he understood they were the foundation of Jerome's philosophy. To keep moving forward, no matter how steep the path. In the distance, the shadowy figures of Lucas and his men lingered, a constant reminder of the challenges ahead. But within Jerome and Edward, a fire had been lit, a fire of determination that no threat could easily extinguish. Night had fallen, and the small room was bathed in the soft glow of an old table lamp. The air was still, punctuated only by the occasional whistle of wind through the cracks in the door, and the steady ticking of a wall clock. Edward sat on a wooden chair, holding a cup of warm water in his hands, his gaze distant as he looked out the window. Jerome sat across from him, his hands clasped together. The tension from their earlier confrontation with Lucas had dissipated, but it was clear he was still reflecting on the events of the day. "Jerome, Lucas won't back down easily, but I believe if we stay steadfast, we'll succeed." Edward turned to face Jerome, setting his cup down on the small table. His expression was a mix of admiration and skepticism. "Edward, do you really think you can change everything? Someone like Lucas, and the systems behind him, they're not easily defeated." Jerome offered a faint smile, calm yet resolute. "Jerome, I don't know if I can win, but if I don't try, nothing will ever change. I can't let the kids grow up in a place where all they know is fear and resignation." Edward fell silent, absorbing Jerome's words. There was a strength in them, not the strength of wealth or power, but of unshakable faith and determination. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. Something about Jerome's conviction stirred a part of him he hadn't felt in years apart he thought he had lost. "Edward, Jerome, you know, I used to be like you." Jerome raised an eyebrow, surprised. Edward continued, his voice softer now, as though he were speaking more to himself than to Jerome. "Edward, when I was younger, I wanted to change the world too. I thought if I earned enough money and power, I could make a real difference. But the more I gained, the more I found myself drowning in the very things I pursued. And then, I forgot why I started in the first place." Jerome listened intently, his empathetic gaze fixed on Edward. He didn't interrupt, letting Edward pour his heart out. Edward let out a bitter chuckle, his eyes tinged with regret. "Edward, now, when I look at you, I see the person I once was, but better. Someone who hasn't been tempted by the empty allure of wealth." Jerome straightened in his seat, his voice steady and encouraging. "Jerome, you haven't lost it, Edward. You just need to find it again. I believe that once you understand what you truly want, you'll figure out the way." Jerome's words were like a spark, igniting a small flame in Edward's heart. Something inside him was shifting, subtle but undeniable. He began to seriously contemplate the next steps in his life. Edward's eyes wandered around Jerome's small room. Despite its simplicity and poverty, everything was neatly arranged, reflecting Jerome's disciplined and thoughtful nature. His gaze landed on a faded family photo on the table. He picked it up and asked, "Edward, the boy in the picture, that's your son, isn't it?" Jerome nodded, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. "Jerome, he's living with his grandparents now. I didn't want him to grow up here. I didn't want him to endure what I did." Edward nodded, his admiration for Jerome deepening. He realized Jerome wasn't just a strong man, he was a father willing to sacrifice his own happiness for his son's future. Edward, you've given up so much and still hold on to your faith in life. How do you do it? Jerome smiled, his eyes bright with hope. Jerome, because I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for the kids in this neighborhood, for my neighbors, and for the dreams I want to pass on. Jerome's words struck a chord deep within Edward. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, not to earn more, not to expand his influence, but to do what was right. Edward, Jerome, I've been thinking a lot. You're right, we have to start somewhere, and I want to start here, with you. Jerome looked surprised but quickly broke into a smile. Jerome, good, but I have to warn you, this won't be easy. Edward chuckled, determination glinting in his eyes. Edward, I've faced many challenges in my life, but I've never done anything that made me feel truly alive. This is my chance to change that. The two began to plan their first steps. Jerome pulled out an old piece of paper and a pen, jotting down tasks, fixing the playground, cleaning up the abandoned school, and rallying more community support. Edward, drawing on his business acumen, suggested ways to organize and delegate tasks. He also proposed seeking outside funding, something Jerome hadn't considered. Jerome, I'm not used to asking for help or funding. Around here, we're used to doing everything ourselves. Edward, I understand, but if we want real change, we need all the support we can get. I'll handle it. Jerome looked at Edward, his eyes filled with gratitude. He could see that Edward wasn't just offering words, he was ready to act. Outside the window, the sound of chirping crickets filled the air, a quiet signal of the night's progression. Inside, a new determination burned in Edward's chest. And for Jerome, the realization that he had found a true ally brought a glimmer of hope for the future. The early morning sun filtered through the cracked windows of Jerome's small room, casting soft streaks of light onto the walls. The air was fresh and unusually quiet, broken only by the cheerful chirping of birds perched on the power lines outside, a sign of a promising new day. Jerome and Edward were already awake. In the tiny kitchen, they sat together, going over the details of their plan. On the worn wooden table between them lay a hastily scrawled list in Jerome's handwriting. 1. Clean up the school. 2. Repair the playground. 3. Rally support from the community. 4. Find funding sources. Edward leaned back in his chair, holding a steaming cup of coffee. He glanced at the list and nodded thoughtfully. Edward, we can start with the simplest task, cleaning up the school. It doesn't require money, just effort, and it's a good way to get everyone involved. Jerome nodded, his eyes filled with determination. Jerome, I'll talk to the neighbors. If everyone pitches in, we can make real progress. Edward smiled, feeling the contagious energy of Jerome's enthusiasm. He realized this wasn't just about renovating a building, it was about rebuilding trust and hope in a community that had long been neglected. That afternoon, Jerome and Edward stood in a small courtyard in front of Alice's house, the usual gathering spot for the neighborhood. The sky was bright and clear, and the sun illuminated the familiar faces of the residents. Alice with her silver hair, a few weathered-looking men with calloused hands, and a group of women cradling small children. Jerome cleared his throat and began to speak. Jerome, everyone, I wanted to share an idea with you. I know life here is tough, but I think we need to start doing something to make a change. I want to work with all of you to fix up the old school and playground. If we work together, I believe we can make this neighborhood better for our kids. The crowd murmured, voices blending with skepticism and curiosity. A man, the local mechanic, stepped forward. Mechanic, Jerome, your idea is good, but where are we supposed to get the money? Building materials aren't free. Before Jerome could answer, Edward stepped forward. His voice was calm but persuasive. Edward, you're right, money is an issue, but the first step doesn't cost anything. We can clean up, fix what we can with our hands. I've seen how you all support each other in tough times. This is our chance to do that again. Edward's words brought a hush over the group. A young woman holding a baby stepped forward, her eyes lighting up with hope. Young woman, I don't know much about fixing things, but I'll come and help clean up. Another man nodded. Man, I've got some tools at home. Not much, but they might come in handy. Gradually, the crowd began to show their support. Jerome glanced at Edward, gratitude clear in his expression. That afternoon, the group gathered outside the gates of the old school. Children darted around the adults, their laughter echoing through the overgrown yard. Jerome organized the volunteers into teams. one to clear weeds in the yard, another to remove trash from inside the building, and a third to patch up the broken windows temporarily. Edward, wearing an old t-shirt and gloves borrowed from Jerome, joined the weed clearing team. Edward, I've never done this before, but I think I'll pick it up quickly enough. Jerome laughed as he lifted a rotting wooden plank. Jerome, just make sure you pull them out by the roots. Like any problem, if you don't deal with the root cause, it'll just come back. Edward chuckled. Edward, simple but true. I'll remember that. The entire afternoon was filled with the sounds of laughter, chatter, and hard work. Adults toiled with determination, while children helped by picking up small pieces of trash. An elderly woman brought a basket of homemade bread to share, lifting spirits further. By the time the sun began to set, the group had made significant progress. Half the yard was cleared, and several classrooms had been cleaned of debris. However, some daunting issues remained: a leaky roof, crumbling walls, and missing materials for proper repairs. A man shook his head, discouraged. Man, Jerome, this is bigger than we thought. I'm not sure we can manage this with just manpower. Edward stepped in before Jerome could respond, his voice steady and encouraging. Edward, we've accomplished a lot today. Don't forget, big changes always start with small steps. This is just the beginning. And I promise, I'll find a way to get us what we need. The group fell silent, their expressions softening with renewed resolve. Jerome clapped Edward on the shoulder and whispered, Jerome, I don't know where you get that confidence, but it sure helps. Edward grinned. Edward, when I'm surrounded by people like you, I'm not afraid of anything. As night fell, Jerome and Edward stood outside the old school, surveying the day's work. The wind carried the fresh scent of earth and newly cleared grass. Edward, voice low, determined. Jerome, I think this is where it all begins, not just for this neighborhood, but for me too. Jerome nodded, his gaze thoughtful, as he looked into the distance. Jerome, we've got a lot of work ahead, but after today, I believe we can do it. The two stood in silence for a while, soaking in the rare peace of the moment. They knew bigger challenges lay ahead, but for now, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet pride in the meaningful progress they had made together. The soft morning light streamed through the window, painting the walls of Jerome's room in hues of gold. Edward woke after a restless night, his mind replaying the events of the previous day. He couldn't shake the hopeful faces of the residents or the sight of the old schoolyard slowly transforming. Yet amidst these glimmers of optimism, the shadowy threat of Lucas and his men loomed large. Rising from bed, Edward made his way to the small kitchen where Jerome was already up, pouring water into a battered kettle. The air was crisp and fresh, but the silence carried a weight that Edward couldn't ignore. Edward couldn't sleep. Jerome turned, offering a faint smile. Jerome, I'm used to it. When there's a lot to think about, I tend to wake up early. Edward sat at the table, accepting a cup of coffee Jerome handed him. After a moment of quiet, he spoke. Edward, Lucas, what do you think he'll do next? Jerome exhaled deeply, his gaze distant. Jerome, Lucas isn't the kind to back down easily. He thrives on control, and what we're doing threatens that. But I'm not afraid. If we show him we won't be intimidated, he'll eventually back off. Edward could hear the conviction in Jerome's voice, but he also sensed the weight of the uncertainty behind it. Lucas was dangerous, and Edward knew determination alone wasn't always enough to stand against brute force. When Jerome left to prepare tools for the day's work, Edward stayed behind, lost in thought. The coffee in his cup had grown cold, but he didn't notice. His eyes stared out the window, while his mind drifted back to memories he had long buried. Edward thought of his younger self, a man filled with ambition and dreams of making a difference. In those days, he had believed in building a better world, in using his success to uplift others. But somewhere along the way, the allure of wealth and power consumed him, leaving behind a version of himself he no longer recognized. Edward to himself, I was a Jerome once, but I let ambition blind me to everything that mattered. The weight of past mistakes settled over in broken relationships, compromised ideals, and opportunities lost. Yet amid the regret, Edward felt a stirring, a chance for redemption. Perhaps this was his moment to make things right. That afternoon, as they returned to the school, Edward noticed Jerome's unusually pensive demeanor. Curious, he asked, but Jerome only replied briefly. Jerome, I've been thinking about how to handle Lucas. Sensing Jerome's hesitation, Edward sat beside him, his tone serious. Edward, Jerome, Do you think it's possible to negotiate with Lucas? Maybe we can find a way to reason with him instead of facing him head on. Jerome turned to Edward, his gaze sharp. Jerome, you don't understand Lucas. He's not someone you can reason with. He only respects strength. Edward frowned, uneasy with Jerome's approach. Edward, but if we keep pushing, do you think he'll just let it go? What about the others? They could get hurt if Lucas decides to act. Jerome remained silent for a long moment before answering. Jerome, I know I'm taking a risk, but I can't let fear dictate our actions. If we back down now, we'll always be under his thumb. Edward couldn't argue with Jerome's courage, but he couldn't dismiss the potential consequences either. The weight of responsibility for the community hung heavily between them. That afternoon, the community gathered again in the schoolyard. They resumed their work clearing debris, scrubbing walls, and patching broken windows, but the air was more subdued than the day before. Conversations were quieter, and Edward could sense the unease in the glances exchanged among the group. Jerome noticed it too, and made an effort to keep spirits high. Jerome, we've already come farther than I expected. Look at the yard, it's so much cleaner. And the classrooms, they're starting to feel like they used to. A young woman sweeping with her children nearby smiled. Young woman Jerome, you always know how to make us feel better. We're not giving up. Her words, simple but sincere, seemed to ease some of the tension. Edward watched Jerome, realizing for the first time that his leadership wasn't just about his words or actions. Jerome was a living source of inspiration for everyone around him. As the day drew to a close, Edward and Jerome sat on a bench in the schoolyard. The wind carried the earthy scent of freshly turned soil and trimmed grass. Edward gazed toward the horizon, where the sun dipped low, casting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Edward, Jerome, I used to think I understood life, but you've shown me that there are things money can't buy. Jerome turned to him with a faint smile. Jerome, I used to think money was all I needed to, but when you lose everything, you realize it's the people around you that matter most. The two sat in silence, letting the weight of the day settle. As darkness enveloped the schoolyard, they both knew the road ahead was fraught with challenges. Yet, in that quiet moment, they shared an unspoken determination, a flame that continued to burn despite the looming shadows. The night shrouded the small neighborhood in darkness, but Jerome's modest room was still aglow from the warm light of a worn-out desk lamp. Edward sat at the table, focused on writing ideas for the school restoration project. A sense of excitement swelled within him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. Outside the window, the wind whispered through deserted alleys. Jerome leaned against the doorframe, his gaze fixed on the distance, though he often spent his evenings reflecting on the next steps. Tonight he felt a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. The next morning, an unusual energy stirred the neighborhood. Residents whispered among themselves, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and surprise. Jerome, on his way to the school, was stopped by Alice. Alice, Jerome, have you seen this? She handed him a crumpled newspaper. On the front page was a large photograph of Edward, accompanied by a bold headline, Billionaire Edward Coleman, missing amidst major scandal. Jerome frowned as a wave of discomfort washed over him. He scanned the article, which detailed Edward's sudden disappearance and rumors linking him to ongoing legal troubles in the business world. Jerome to himself, he didn't tell me about this. Arriving at the schoolyard, Jerome found Edward cheerfully organizing tools with the other volunteers. Morning sunlight illuminated his face, but now Jerome looked at him differently, not with distrust, but with a tinge of quiet disappointment. Jerome walked up and held the newspaper out in front of Edward. Jerome, Edward, is there something you want to tell me? Edward froze. His eyes fell on the headline, and a flicker of realization crossed his face. He sighed deeply, setting down the tool he was holding. Edward, Jerome, I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how. Jerome, you thought keeping it a secret was the best way. Everything we're working on, don't you think it might be affected when people find out who you really are? Edward met Jerome's gaze, his voice steady and earnest. Edward, I'm not running from my past. Jerome, I just needed a chance to start over. Everything I've done here is real. I want to help you, help this community, and most of all, help myself become someone better. Jerome studied Edward's face for a long moment, searching for any sign of deceit. At last, he nodded slightly. Jerome, I believe you, Edward, but trust isn't easy to build. Once it's lost, it's nearly impossible to regain. Edward nodded solemnly, his gratitude evident, underscored, but the matter wasn't so easily settled. News of Edward's identity spread quickly through the neighborhood, sparking anxiety and suspicion. A neighbor approached Jerome, his voice tinged with frustration. "Neighbor, Jerome, why didn't you tell us this man was a billionaire? How can we trust him? Who knows what he's really up to?" Jerome kept his composure and responded firmly, "Jerome, Edward isn't here to take advantage of anyone. He's been helping us since day one, and I trust his intentions. Look at what we've accomplished because of his help." Despite Jerome's reassurances, not everyone was convinced. A cloud of doubt lingered, adding to the pressure Jerome already felt. Underscored. That afternoon, as the volunteers worked at the schoolyard, Lucas made an unexpected appearance, holding a copy of the same newspaper. His smug grin exuded malice. "Lucas, well, so you're not just some wanderer. After all, you're Edward Coleman, the billionaire. I hear you're in trouble. Maybe I should let a few of my friends know where to find you." Jerome stepped in front of Edward, his voice firm. "Jerome, Lucas, you don't belong here. We're doing something good for the neighborhood, and you should stay out of it." Lucas chuckled darkly and stepped closer to Jerome. "Lucas, good, we're just using each other. You think a billionaire like him really cares about a bunch of nobodies like you?" Edward, unable to remain silent, stepped forward. His tone was calm but carried an undeniable authority. "Edward, Lucas, I don't need you to understand me. I just need you to stay out of our way. If you keep interfering, be ready to face the consequences." For a moment, Lucas hesitated, but then he laughed loudly, backing off slightly. "Lucas, fine, but remember, I'll be watching, waiting for you to fail." As Lucas and his men sauntered off, Jerome turned to Edward, his expression a mix of concern and respect. "Jerome, you didn't have to take that risk. Lucas is dangerous." Edward smiled faintly, placing a hand on Jerome's shoulder. "Edward, you taught me that if we don't stand up, nothing will change. It's time for me to follow through on that lesson." Jerome's expression softened, and he nodded. He knew the challenges ahead were only growing, but Edward was proving to be a steadfast ally. Underscore. That evening, after the volunteers had left, Jerome and Edward sat on the bench in the schoolyard. The moon cast a soft glow, reflecting off the newly repaired windows. Edward voiced low, determined. "Jerome, I can't undo my past, but I can do what's right now, and I'm going to. No matter what it takes." Jerome smiled warmly. "Jerome, we'll do it, Edward." Together, they sat in peaceful silence, savoring the rare calm amid their stormy journey. Though obstacles loomed, they both knew their resolve burned brighter than ever. The next morning, the once peaceful neighborhood seemed to hum with tension. Whispers filled the streets, and suspicious glances darted toward the old schoolyard now, the focal point of Jerome and Edward's restoration efforts. The newspaper featuring Edward's image and past had sown seeds of unease among the community. Jerome stood in the schoolyard, surveying a small gathering of familiar faces. Their expressions had changed. Where there had once been hope and enthusiasm, there was now doubt and apprehension. A middle-aged man stepped forward, his tone blunt. "Man, Jerome, you said we were doing this for the future of the neighborhood, but now look at this him." He pointed toward Edward, who was chatting with some volunteers. "He's not one of us. How do we know he doesn't have his own agenda?" Jerome's calm demeanor held firm, though his voice carried a quiet urgency. "Jerome, I've told you all before. It is here because he wants to help. He's been working alongside us since day one. Nothing about that has changed." The man shook his head, frustration etched in his features. "Man, I don't trust rich folks. They've only ever taken advantage of us." His words sparked a murmur through the crowd, a ripple of shared unease. Jerome could feel the atmosphere shifting, like a small flame spreading in dry grass. Underscore later, after the crowd dispersed, Jerome found Edward cleaning inside one of the classrooms. Sitting on a broken chair, Edward looked tired but focused. "Jerome, Edward, we've got a problem. Some people are starting to doubt you." Edward looked up, his expression grave. "Edward, I know. I can feel it. But Jerome, I don't blame them. If I were in their position, I'd probably be skeptical too." Jerome sat across from Edward, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "Jerome, I trust you, Edward, but my trust alone isn't enough. We need to do something to show them you're not a threat." Edward nodded, determination flickering in his eyes. "Edward, you're right. Trust isn't something you can demand, it has to be earned, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn theirs." Underscore that evening, as the neighborhood settled into the quiet of night, Edward called Jerome aside, his tone serious. "Edward, I have an idea, but it might be a big gamble." Jerome crossed his arms, studying Edward with curiosity. "Jerome, I'm not one to shy away from risks. Tell me." Edward took a deep breath before speaking. "Edward, I want to hold a community meeting. I'll stand in front of everyone and tell them the truth about me, everything. My past, my mistakes, and why I'm here." Jerome stared at him, momentarily stunned. After a pause, he asked, "Jerome, are you sure about this? They might not react the way you're hoping." Edward nodded firmly. "Edward, I've spent my whole life running from my mistakes, but I've realized the only way forward is to face them. If they still don't trust me, at least I'll know I did everything I could." Jerome held Edward's gaze, sensing the resolve behind his words. Finally, he nodded. Jerome, "All right, I'll stand beside you. We'll do this together." 2 days later, the meeting took place in the schoolyard. Strings of makeshift lights hung from trees illuminated the area, creating an atmosphere both intimate and solemn. Almost everyone in the neighborhood showed up, seated on mismatched plastic chairs, their eyes fixed on Jerome and Edward standing at the center. Jerome began. "Jerome, thank you all for coming. Tonight, Edward wants to speak with you and share his story. He wants you to hear the truth." Edward stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. Despite his nerves, he knew this moment was necessary. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Edward, I know many of you don't trust me, and I don't blame you, but I want you to understand who I am and why I'm here." He shared his story, his early days as an ambitious entrepreneur, his rise to wealth and power, and the mistakes that led to scandals and the collapse of his reputation. He held nothing back, openly admitting to the greed that had blinded him and the pain he had caused others. "Edward, I spent most of my life believing money and power could solve everything. I was wrong. They turned me into someone I didn't recognize. When I came here, I realized I had a chance to do something meaningful. That's why I'm here, not because I need anything from you, but because I need to prove to myself that I can be better." The crowd fell silent. Edward scanned their faces, searching for any hint of their thoughts, but their expressions were unreadable. Finally, Alice, the elderly woman who was a cornerstone of the community, stood up, slowly. She approached Edward and spoke. "Alice, I don't know much about you, Edward, but I've seen you working every day, helping everyone without asking for anything. To me, actions speak louder than words, and I believe you." Her words broke the tension like a floodgate. A young mother chimed in. "Young woman, me too. You've been here, working with us. That's enough for me." Gradually, others began to voice their agreement. The skepticism in their eyes softened into understanding. Standing beside Edward, Jerome felt a swell of pride. When the meeting ended, Jerome and Edward lingered in the schoolyard as the residents dispersed. Jerome turned to Edward, a faint smile on his face. "Jerome, you did it. Not everyone can face their past like that." Edward smiled, his voice calm yet relieved. "Edward, I think I finally understand what courage really means." Above them, the moon cast a silvery glow over the schoolyard, a symbol of the hope that had been rekindled in the hearts of the community that night. The morning began with tension rippling through the neighborhood. Though the sun cast a warm glow over the schoolyard, an unspoken unease lingered among the residents. Inside the yard, Jerome and Edward were reviewing their progress. "Jerome, we've done so much already, but the roof is still our biggest problem. I don't think we have enough materials to fix it." Edward pondered for a moment, then nodded. "Edward, I'll handle that. I've contacted an old friend, a supplier in construction materials. I'm confident he'll help us." Jerome smiled, appreciating Edward's resolve. He was about to respond when a loud crash shattered the calm. Bang! Everyone turned toward the source of the noise. The school's metal gate swung open violently, kicked in by Lucas and his 3 henchmen. Lucas strode into the yard, his face contorted with anger, his eyes gleaming with menace. "Lucas, I warned you, but you just couldn't listen, could you?" He marched forward, his gaze locked on Jerome and Edward. Pointing a finger at Edward, his voice was sharp and accusing. "Lucas, who do you think you are, a billionaire? Don't think your money can buy respect here?" Edward straightened, remaining composed. Before he could respond, Jerome stepped in front of him, shielding him from Lucas. "Jerome, Lucas, what are you doing? We're not hurting anyone. All we're trying to do is restore this school for the kids." Lucas sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "Lucas, Restore, don't make me laugh. All you're doing is wasting my time. I make money off this place, and I don't need you screwing it up. Jerome, this place doesn't belong to you. Lucas, it belongs to the community. Lucas's face darkened as he stepped closer to Jerome, his voice low and threatening. Lucas, you're a fool. Jerome, stop now, or you'll regret it. Edward stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. Edward, Lucas, I don't know who you're used to intimidating here, but I'm not afraid of you. If you keep harassing us, I'll take this to the authorities. Lucas laughed a cold, hollow sound. Lucas, you think the cops scare me? Go ahead, try it. Let's see how far you get. Edward's gaze didn't waver, his tone growing stronger. Edward, maybe you're not afraid of me, but I'm not backing down. Do whatever you want, but we won't stop. Lucas hesitated for a brief moment, thrown off by Edward's calm defiance. He quickly recovered, motioning to his men. Lucas, let's go. I'll see how long you can keep this up. Before leaving, Lucas turned back one last time, his voice laced with venom. Lucas, you'll pay for this. I'll make sure of it. As Lucas and his men disappeared, the air in the schoolyard grew heavy with tension. A few residents looked visibly shaken. A woman approached Jerome, her voice trembling. Woman, Jerome, we can't keep doing this. Lucas isn't someone to mess with. If he comes back, he could hurt us. Jerome kept his composure and responded calmly. Jerome, I know Lucas is dangerous. But if we stop now, everything we've worked for will mean nothing. We can't let him win. Edward stepped closer, his voice reassuring but firm. Edward, I understand your fear, but I promise to protect this community. I'll find a way to ensure Lucas can't harm anyone here. Despite their words, unease lingered on the faces of the residents. The gravity of Lucas's threats weighed heavily on everyone. That night, Jerome and Edward sat in Jerome's small room, strategizing ways to counter Lucas's intimidation. Edward held a piece of paper, jotting down potential solutions. 1. Hire security to guard the school and community. 2. Report Lucas's actions to local authorities. 3. Rally support from external organizations. Jerome shook his head, his tone cautious. Jerome, these won't be easy. Edward, Lucas has connections with powerful people here. We could face serious backlash. Edward placed a reassuring hand on Jerome's shoulder, his eyes reflecting determination. Edward, Jerome, I've spent my life dealing with powerful people. Lucas isn't the first, and he won't be the last. We just need to stay persistent. Jerome was silent for a moment, then nodded. Jerome, all right, but we have to be smart about this. If we make a wrong move, Lucas will have more reason to escalate. Standing by the window, Jerome and Edward gazed out at the quiet neighborhood bathed in moonlight. Though aware of the challenges ahead, neither showed signs of retreating. Jerome voiced steady. We started this for the kids, and we're not stopping now. Edward smiled, his eyes filled with deep camaraderie. Edward, you're right. Jerome, nothing can make us back down. The two remained there, soaking in the rare tranquility of the night, silently preparing for the trials still to come. The morning in the neighborhood began with its usual serenity. Children laughed and played on the sidewalks, their voices ringing through the crisp air. But for Jerome and Edward, the calm was anything but reassuring. Both men knew Lucas was not one to let things go, as Jerome and Edward stood in the schoolyard discussing plans to clear another area. A sharp, panicked scream echoed from the street. Woman, fire, there's a fire. Jerome spun around, his heart sinking as he saw black smoke rising from a nearby house, Elisa's home. Without hesitation, Jerome and Edward sprinted toward the flames. Alice was outside, trembling, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she watched the fire consume her home. Smoke billowed from the ground floor windows, and the heat radiated across the street, stopping anyone from getting close. Jerome, Alice, is there anyone still inside? Alice coughed, struggling to speak through her fear and tears. Alice, no. Thank God I got out in time, but everything I own is in there. Edward placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his voice calm and soothing. Edward, what matters is that you're safe. Don't worry, we'll help you. Jerome rallied a few neighbors to bring buckets of water to fight the flames, but the fire raged too fiercely. They could only watch helplessly as it consumed the structure. When the flames subsided, and the smoke began to clear, one of the neighbors spotted something near the doorway, a discarded gas can. Jerome picked it up, his expression darkening as he examined it. Neighbor Jerome, do you think Lucas did this? Jerome didn't respond immediately. but his silence spoke volumes. Edward stood nearby, his fists clenched tightly. Edward, this isn't just a warning, it's an attack. He wants to scare us into stopping. Jerome nodded grimly. Jerome, we can't let him succeed. Despite their resolve, fear began to ripple through the community. The once enthusiastic volunteers became hesitant, and fewer people showed up to work at the school. That evening, a man approached Jerome, his face etched with worry. Man, Jerome, we should stop. Lucas is too dangerous. I can't risk my family getting caught in the crossfire. Jerome tried to reassure him, his voice steady. Jerome, I understand your concern, but if we stop now, Lucas will continue to control our lives. This is our chance to break free. The man didn't look convinced, and Jerome watched him leave, his heart heavy with the weight of the community's fear. Later that night, Jerome sat slumped in a chair in his small room, his head bowed. Edward entered quietly, placing a hand on Jerome's shoulder. Edward, you're carrying too much. Jerome, this isn't just your burden, it's ours. Jerome looked up, his eyes filled with pain. Jerome, Edward, I can't help but feel responsible. If something happens to them because of this. Edward sat across from him, his tone firm yet empathetic. Edward, Jerome, you've done something no one else dared to do. You stood up to Lucas. That courage is what this community needs. They may be scared now, but I believe they'll find their strength through you. Jerome remained silent for a moment before nodding slowly. Jerome, I won't give up, but we need a better plan to deal with Lucas. Edward pulled out a sheet of paper, and together they began brainstorming. 1. Increase security. Edward proposed hiring professional guards to protect the school and the community. 2. Support Alice. Allocate resources to help Alice rebuild her home, demonstrating solidarity and resilience to the community. 3. File a formal report, collect evidence against Lucas, and submit it to the local police, forcing authorities to take action. Jerome hesitated as they discussed the last point. Jerome, Edward, do you really think the police will help? Lucas has connections, they might just look the other way. Edward nodded, his expression unwavering. Edward, maybe they'll resist at first, but we'll make it impossible for them to ignore us. Justice has to prevail, Jerome. That night, as their plans took shape, Jerome and Edward stepped outside to the quiet schoolyard. The faint glow of the neighborhood's dim streetlights illuminated their determined faces. Jerome, voice steady. Lucas has gone further than I expected, but I won't let him destroy this dream. Edward met Jerome's gaze, his eyes mirroring the same resolve. Edward, we won't let him win. This fight isn't just for us, it's for everyone here. Under the dark sky, with the scent of smoke still lingering in the air, the two men stood resolute. The challenges ahead were immense, but their determination burned brighter. Fueled by the hope and resilience of the community they fought for, the first morning of the week dawned softly, with golden sunlight filtering into the old schoolyard. The air was unusually quiet. Many in the neighborhood had hesitated to continue helping with the restoration after Lucas's threats. But Jerome and Edward pressed on, knowing their determination was the key to rekindling the community's spirit. Jerome moved through the playground, marking areas needing repairs. Edward, phone in hand, was finalizing details with a construction materials supplier. Edward, yes, we'll need wooden planks, cement, and paint. Can you deliver them by this weekend? Perfect, I'll process the payment right away. Ending the call, Edward approached Jerome, his face reflecting some relief. Edward, the materials will arrive soon, but we need to beef up security. I don't want anything sabotaged before we finish. Jerome nodded, his resolve firm. Jerome, I've spoken to someone who knows a professional security team. We'll hire them to patrol the area. Edward smiled approvingly. Edward, good. If we stay persistent, Lucas won't stand a chance. At noon, Jerome and Edward visited Alice's burned-down home. The scorched walls and collapsed roof bore testimony to Lucas's warning. Inside, everything was reduced to ash and ruin. Alice sat on the charred front steps, her gaze heavy with sorrow. Jerome approached, resting a comforting hand on her shoulder. Jerome, Alice, we're going to rebuild your home. It's our top priority. Alice looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and gratitude. Alice. Jerome, Edward, you've already done so much for this neighborhood. I don't want to be a burden. Edward crouched to meet her eye level, his voice earnest. Edward, you're not a burden, Alice. This isn't just about rebuilding your house, it's about showing Lucas he can't break this community. Leaving Alice with renewed hope, Jerome and Edward walked away with even greater determination. Her house would be the first victory in their fight for the neighborhood. That afternoon, Jerome and Edward organized a small meeting in the schoolyard. They knew fear had taken hold of many residents after the fire, but they believed unity could be reignited through decisive action. Jerome stood in the center of the group, his voice clear and resolute. Jerome, I know many of you are scared, but if we stop now, Lucas will think he's won. I can't accept that. This is our chance to change our lives, not just for us, but for our children. Edward stepped forward to add his support. Edward, change is never easy, but together, we can make it happen. I promise to provide the resources we need to finish this project, but I can't do it alone. I need all of you. A hush fell over the gathering. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, a young woman holding her child stepped forward. Young woman, Jerome, Edward, I'll help. I don't want my child to grow up in fear. Gradually others began to nod in agreement. Jerome smiled, sensing the spark of hope returning. 3 days later, the security team Jerome hired arrived. They were a group of capable young professionals trained to handle patrols and potential threats. Jerome assigned them to guard the schoolyard and the incoming construction materials. Edward watched as the guards took their positions, a sense of relief evident in his demeanor. Edward, Jerome, this was the right move. Lucas will think twice before trying anything now. Jerome remained cautious but nodded. Jerome maybe, but we can't let our guard down. Lucas won't give up easily. By the weekend, trucks carrying materials began arriving. Planks of wood, sacks of cement, and cans of paint filled the schoolyard, ready for the next phase of restoration. The sight of the deliveries drew residents back, tools in hand and renewed enthusiasm in their hearts. Jerome stood in the center of the yard, directing teams into smaller groups. Jerome, this group will focus on repairing the roof. That group will clean and paint the walls. Let's work quickly but carefully. Edward joined a team repairing the roof, working alongside older men from the neighborhood. Though unused to physical labor, he put in his best effort, finding satisfaction in contributing to something meaningful. That evening, Jerome and Edward sat on a bench in the schoolyard, looking at the neatly stacked materials and reflecting on the day's accomplishments. The cool night breeze carried a sense of renewal and optimism. Jerome voiced steady. Edward, we've come a long way. But I know Lucas won't let us finish without a fight. Edward's gaze drifted toward the horizon, his eyes filled with resolve. Edward, if he comes back, we'll face him together. We're too close to stop now. The two men sat quietly, enveloped by the darkness of the night and the faint glow of streetlights, readying themselves for the larger battles they knew were yet to come. The morning began with a deceptive calm. The old schoolyard, a symbol of unity and resilience, was slowly transforming into a beacon of hope. Freshly painted white walls gleamed in the sunlight, and stacks of neatly arranged timber awaited installation. It was a picture of progress, but for Jerome and Edward, an unshakable unease lingered in the air. Jerome stood in the middle of the yard, clipboard in hand, checking off items from the restoration plan. Edward approached him, ending a phone call with a relieved smile. Edward, everything's on track. If nothing unexpected happens, we'll have the roof done by next week. Jerome nodded but remained cautious. Jerome, I wish I could feel as optimistic as you. But Lucas isn't the kind to back down. I have a bad feeling he's waiting for the right moment to strike. Edward's expression grew serious, his jaw tightening. Edward, if Lucas comes back, we'll face him. I didn't come here to run, and neither did you. Jerome managed a faint smile, appreciating Edward's conviction. Yet, the tension in his chest refused to dissipate. As the sun climbed higher, the community worked diligently. Residents cleared the playground and prepared materials for the next phase of construction. Then, without warning, a deafening explosion shattered the tranquil air. Boom! The ground seemed to tremble as a thick column of black smoke rose from the far corner of the yard, where the construction materials were stored. Jerome, what was that? He and Edward sprinted toward the source of the explosion. Flames raged through the materials, wood, paint cans, and part of the temporary shelter were engulfed in an inferno. The acrid smell of burning paint stung their noses as shouts of alarm filled the air. Edward grabbed Jerome's arm, his voice urgent. Edward, this isn't an accident, this is Lucas. Jerome's expression darkened, but instead of anger, he snapped into action. Jerome, Edward, get more people to bring water. I'll make sure no one's caught in the fire. Edward nodded and rushed off to coordinate support. Residents scrambled with buckets of water and damp blankets, battling the blaze, but the flames were relentless, consuming most of the materials within half an hour. When the fire was finally extinguished, the yard was a mess of charred debris and smoke. Jerome stood amidst the ashes, staring at the destruction. Edward approached, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. Edward, we've lost so much, but at least no one was hurt. Jerome nodded, his gaze fixed on the smoldering remains. Jerome, this wasn't just about destroying materials. Lucas wanted to destroy our spirit. He's testing us. A resident approached hesitantly, his voice trembling. Resident, Jerome, I saw some strangers leave just before the fire started. They were on motorbikes, and they were laughing. Jerome clenched his fists, his jaw tightening in frustration. Edward placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Edward, Jerome, we can't let him keep doing this. It's time to take stronger action. That afternoon, Jerome and Edward called an emergency meeting in the schoolyard. The mood was grim. Fear hung heavy over the gathered residents. A man stood up, his voice shaking. Man, Jerome, Edward, we can't keep going. Lucas burned our materials, and he could hurt our families. I won't risk it anymore. A woman spoke next, clutching her young child. Woman, I believe in you, Jerome, but we can't protect everyone. Lucas is too dangerous. Jerome scanned the crowd, seeing the anxiety and doubt in their eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, but Edward stepped forward, his voice firm and resonant. Edward, I know you're afraid, and I understand, but think about this: if we stop now, Lucas wins, and he won't stop there. He'll keep doing this to anyone who dares stand up to him. This isn't just about the school or the materials, it's about our future, and the future of our children. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. His voice softened but carried unwavering strength. Edward, I've spent my life running from my mistakes, but this time, I refuse to back down. If you stay, I promise to protect you with everything I have. If you choose to leave, I won't blame you. But I can't walk away from this fight. A heavy silence settled over the yard. Then, slowly, Alice, the oldest resident of the neighborhood, rose to her feet. Her voice was frail but resolute. Alice, I won't give up. Jerome and Edward have done more for this community than anyone else ever has. If they're not afraid of Lucas, neither am I. Her words ignited a spark. One by one, others stood and voiced their agreement. Jerome glanced at Edward, a flicker of hope returning to his eyes. That evening, as the residents returned home, Jerome and Edward sat on a bench in the schoolyard, staring at the charred remains of the materials. The faint glow of streetlights illuminated their weary faces. Jerome voiced steady. Lucas thinks he can scare us into quitting, but I won't let him win. We've come too far to stop now. Edward nodded, his expression resolute. Edward, we'll face him, Jerome, and this time, we'll make sure he has no choice but to stop. Under the starlit sky, the two men sat in silence, gathering their strength for the inevitable confrontation, a showdown that would determine the future of their community. The next afternoon, a heavy tension hung over the neighborhood. Though work continued in the schoolyard, an unspoken unease gripped everyone. Jerome and Edward knew Lucas wouldn't stop, and the time had come to act before he caused more harm. Jerome approached Edward, who stood by the yard's edge, studying the restoration plan intently. Jerome, Edward, it's time. We can't let Lucas keep doing as he pleases. Edward nodded, his voice low but resolute. Edward, I agree. He needs to know he can't intimidate us without consequences. Jerome hesitated, his gaze fixed on Edward. Jerome, are you sure about meeting him face to face? Lucas isn't the type to listen to reason. Edward met Jerome's eyes with unwavering determination. Edward, we don't have a choice. If we don't face him now, everything we've built will fall apart. After a moment's pause, Jerome nodded in agreement. He used his old connections to send a message to Lucas, arranging a meeting at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the neighborhood, a neutral location far from the schoolyard to protect the community from potential retaliation. That evening, Jerome and Edward arrived at the warehouse. The wind howled through the broken windows, carrying an eerie chill. The dim light of a distant street lamp cast long shadows on the crumbling walls. Jerome entered first, scanning the space cautiously for any sign of danger. Edward followed, clutching a folder tightly, evidence they had gathered of Lucas's illegal activities. Footsteps echoed from the entrance, interrupting their thoughts. Lucas strode in, flanked by two henchmen. He wore his usual leather jacket, his face twisted in a mocking grin. "Lucas, I'm curious. Jerome, did you call me here to surrender?" Jerome's expression remained calm, though his eyes were sharp. "Jerome, we need to talk, Lucas. One last time." Lucas laughed, his voice reverberating through the empty space. "Lucas, talk. You think I've got time for this nonsense?" Edward stepped forward, his voice firm and steady. "Edward, Lucas, listen carefully. We're not here to beg. We're giving you one last chance to back off before this escalates further." Lucas's smirk faltered slightly as Edward placed the folder on an old table in the center of the warehouse and opened it. "Edward, this is the evidence of everything you've done. Arson, threats, vandalism. We've already sent some of it to the police. If you keep pushing us, the rest will go public." Lucas glanced at the folder, his expression hardening as he skimmed its contents. For a moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by defiance. "Lucas, you think the cops will do anything to me? You're delusional. I've got people in high places, and no one here has the guts to challenge me." Jerome stepped forward, his voice steady and full of conviction. "Jerome, that may have been true before, but not anymore. This community isn't afraid of you anymore, Lucas. We'll fight to protect what's ours." Lucas stared at Jerome and Edward, weighing his options. Finally, he sneered, his voice dripping with menace. "Lucas, I won't back down, but if you want to fight, be ready to pay the price." As Lucas turned to leave, he cast a cold, piercing glance at Edward. "Lucas, and you, Edward, you don't belong here. If you're smart, you'll get out while you still can." The room fell silent as Lucas and his men disappeared into the night. Jerome and Edward remained rooted in place, the tension in the air almost tangible. "Jerome, Edward, do you think he'll stop?" Edward shook his head, his expression a mix of concern and determination. "Edward, no, Jerome. He won't stop, but neither will we." Jerome's gaze hardened, a spark of defiance lighting his eyes. "Jerome, if he wants a fight, we'll be ready." On their way back, they passed the schoolyard, where strings of small lights illuminated the freshly painted walls. Edward paused, taking in the sight of what they had accomplished, despite the odds. Edward's voice heavy with emotion. "Jerome, I've never had anything worth fighting for like this. We can't let Lucas destroy it." Jerome smiled faintly, the resolve in his voice mirroring Edward's. "Jerome, you're right, Edward. This isn't just about the school or the neighborhood. It's about our pride and the unity of everyone here." Under the canopy of the night sky, the two men stood together, readying themselves for the inevitable confrontation of battle to defend not just a schoolyard, but the spirit and hope of an entire community. 2 days later, the quiet evening blanketed the neighborhood once again. Despite lingering fears, the community continued their work at the schoolyard. The soft glow of string lights wrapped around the yard created a warm, hopeful atmosphere. Laughter and chatter began to fill the air once more, signaling a return of confidence among the people. Jerome stood beside Edward, watching residents paint the walls and tidy up the playground. "Jerome, Edward, I think we're starting to win back their trust. That's more important than anything else." Edward nodded, a faint smile gracing his face. "Edward, you're right. They're realizing they're not alone. And Lucas won't be able to destroy that with a few fires." They shared a moment of optimism amidst the storm of challenges. But that moment was shattered by a sudden, jarring noise. Bang! The metal gate at the schoolyard's entrance crashed open. A truck roared into the yard, its headlights blazing and blinding everyone in its path. Jerome shouting, "Everyone, get back, move quickly." The truck screeched to a halt, and out stepped Lucas, flanked by 3 of his cronies. In his hand, he brandished a baseball bat, the smirk on his face oozing menace. One of his men held a small pistol, its cold metallic gleam catching the light. "Lucas, I warned you, Jerome. You should have stayed in your place. Now, I'm going to show you who's really in charge here." With a signal from Lucas, one of his lackeys began smashing tools and supplies scattered across the yard. Panic spread as residents fled the scene, trying to distance themselves from Lucas and his gang. Edward stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "Edward, Lucas, stop this madness right now. If you continue, I'll make sure you pay for every bit of damage you've done." Lucas chuckled mockingly, walking toward Edward. "Lucas, What are you going to do, billionaire? Call the cops, the media. You think I'm afraid of that? Jerome moved to stand between Edward and Lucas, his voice cold and unwavering. Jerome, Lucas, this is your last chance. If you do anything more, we won't hold back. Lucas sneered, raising his bat, as though to strike. But before he could act, a voice called out from the shadows. Resident, we won't let you destroy this place anymore. Emerging from the darkness, groups of residents stepped forward, armed with shovels, rakes, and whatever tools they could find. Their weapons were crude, but their eyes burned with determination. A middle-aged man, standing at the forefront, locked eyes with Lucas. Man, this is our home, Lucas. You have no right to harm it. For the first time, Lucas hesitated. The sheer number of people standing against him was unexpected. He quickly masked his unease with a smirk. Lucas, you think rusty shovels and gardening tools can stop me? Edward stepped forward, his voice ringing with conviction. Edward, it's not the tools, Lucas, it's their will. And the will of a united community is stronger than anything you can bring. Lucas glanced at his henchmen. One of them shifted uneasily, clearly unsure of their next move. Before things could escalate further, the sound of sirens pierced the tense atmosphere. A police car pulled up at the gate, its flashing blue and red lights illuminating the yard. Jerome and Edward exchanged relieved glances as two officers stepped out of the vehicle. One of them, a younger officer Edward had met during an earlier visit to the station, approached with authority. Officer, Lucas, we've received reports of vandalism and threats. You're coming with us. Lucas froze, his confidence faltering. He attempted to recover, his voice dripping with defiance. Lucas, you've got nothing on me. I didn't do anything. The officer gestured toward a resident holding up their phone. Officer, we have witnesses, Lucas, and video evidence of everything you've done tonight. You're under arrest. Lucas's face darkened as he was handcuffed and escorted to the police car. The tension in the yard began to dissipate as the vehicle drove away, taking Lucas out of their lives for good. The residents gathered around Jerome and Edward, their faces a mix of relief and newfound resolve. A woman stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. Woman, Jerome, Edward, we've been afraid for so long, but because of you, we've realized that standing together is the only way to protect what's ours. Her words sparked a wave of agreement. Edward stepped forward, addressing the group with a steady voice. Edward, tonight, we didn't just defeat Lucas, we defeated the fear that's held this community back for years, and this is only the beginning. Jerome joined him, his voice filled with gratitude and determination. Jerome, this community is stronger than I ever imagined. Together, we'll keep building a better future. Under the starlit sky, the residents began cleaning up the mess left behind, their spirits unbroken. Jerome and Edward sat on their familiar bench, watching as the community came together once more. Jerome, Edward, tonight I realized that true strength doesn't come from one person. It comes from the unity of an entire community. Edward nodded, a gentle smile on his face. Edward, Jerome, I never thought I'd find purpose in a place like this, but now I understand this is exactly where I'm meant to be. As the stars glimmered above, the fire of hope burned brighter than ever in the hearts of the community, ready to forge a future free from fear. The morning sun shone brightly over the small neighborhood, casting golden light onto the transformed schoolyard. Weeks of relentless effort by Jerome, Edward, and the community had finally borne fruit. What was once an abandoned and crumbling building now stood renewed. The walls gleamed white, the sturdy roof gleamed under the sunlight, and the playground boasted shiny swings and slides. Small flower pots, lovingly contributed by residents, lined the pathways, adding splashes of color to the scene. Jerome stood in the center of the yard, his eyes fixed on the children running and laughing with pure joy. A faint smile graced his lips, a smile born of gratitude and fulfillment. Edward approached, holding 2 cups of steaming coffee. He handed one to Jerome, smiling gently. Edward, Jerome, take a look. This is what we fought for. Jerome accepted the cup, his eyes glistening with emotion. Jerome, Edward, this isn't just a school, it's hope, and we've brought it back to this community. That afternoon, the community gathered in the schoolyard for a small celebration. Wooden tables were lined up, laden with simple yet hearty dishes prepared by the residents. Laughter and cheerful conversations filled the air, chasing away the shadows Lucas had once cast over the neighborhood. Alice, with her silver hair and kind eyes, stepped onto a makeshift stage. Her voice quivered as she spoke, but it carried the weight of heartfelt emotion. Alice, Jerome, Edward, and everyone here. I don't have the words to express my gratitude. Thank you for not giving up. Thank you for bringing light back to this neighborhood. Applause erupted, echoing across the yard. Jerome and Edward stepped onto the stage, facing the crowd whose hopeful faces mirrored their own sense of accomplishment. Jerome took the microphone, his voice steady and warm. Jerome, I couldn't have done this alone. The only thing I had was faith in myself, in Edward, and in all of you. Together, we've turned the impossible into reality. This school is proof of the power of unity. Edward followed, his voice carrying the wisdom of his journey. Edward, I once believed that money was the greatest strength, but I was wrong. True strength comes from trust, patience, and people who stand up for what's right. Thank you for letting me be a part of this miracle. The applause grew louder, lasting longer than before. As the celebration wound down, Edward sat alone on the familiar bench in the schoolyard. He watched the children play and the families share moments of connection. A rare peace settled over him. Jerome joined him, sitting beside him quietly for a moment before speaking. Jerome, do you think, if you hadn't met me, you would have found this? Edward pondered for a moment, then shook his head. Edward, I don't think so. Jerome, you saved me, not from Lucas, but from the man I used to be. I don't know how to thank you for that. Jerome smiled, resting a hand on Edward's shoulder. Jerome, you don't need to thank me, Edward. We saved each other. And now, we can both take pride in what we've accomplished. Edward nodded, his eyes shining with a serenity he hadn't known in years. Underscored in the weeks that followed, the school became more than a place of learning for children. It became the heart of the neighborhood. Free classes for adults, community meetings, and workshops were all held within its walls, bringing people closer together. One afternoon, as Jerome helped a group of children repair a swing, Edward approached him, holding a newspaper. On the front page was a picture of Edward and Jerome standing in front of the newly restored school, accompanied by the headline, "From Fallen Billionaire to Community Hero, The Journey of Edward Coleman." Jerome glanced at the newspaper and chuckled softly. Jerome, you've made the front page again. This time, for the right reasons. Edward smiled, pride flickering in his eyes. Edward, if someone had told me a year ago that I'd find meaning in my life here, I'd have laughed in their face. But now, I can't imagine belonging anywhere else. As the day turned to dusk, the glow from the schoolyard lights illuminated the neighborhood. Jerome and Edward stood at the edge of the yard, watching the children play and families gather. Jerome, Edward, do you think someday, the world out there will learn something from us? Edward looked at Jerome, then back at the vibrant scene before them. His voice was soft but resolute. Edward, Jerome, the world has already learned from you, from your kindness, your determination, and your faith. This is just the beginning, and it will spread. They exchanged a smile of mutual understanding. Under a starry sky, they knew they hadn't just rebuilt a school or strengthened a community, they had rebuilt themselves. Together, they had proven that hope, unity, and courage could overcome any darkness. 3 months after the school's grand opening, the small neighborhood had undergone a complete transformation. Clean streets, freshly painted homes, and smiles now adorned the faces of people who once lived in hardship. The school had become the heart of the community. Every morning, children's laughter echoed through the classrooms. Every afternoon, families gathered in the schoolyard, sharing their stories after a day's work. In the evenings, the school became a meeting place, where dreams of a better future were nurtured. On a bright morning, Edward sat on a bench in the schoolyard, gazing at the space he and Jerome had built together. In his hand was a plane ticket, and his thoughts weighed heavily on him. Jerome approached, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. He sat down next to Edward, his eyes catching sight of the ticket before turning to Edward. Jerome, you're leaving. Edward nodded, his gaze lingering on the children playing nearby. Edward, yes, I received a letter from my family. They want me to come back. I think it's time I dealt with the unfinished chapters of my life. Jerome remained silent for a moment before placing a hand on Edward's shoulder. Jerome, you've done more than you realize, Edward, not just for me, but for everyone here. Wherever you go, this school, this community, will always carry your mark. Edward turned to Jerome, a gentle smile on his face. Edward, Jerome, you've shown me that change isn't impossible. You didn't just transform this community, you transformed me. Thank you. Jerome shook his head, his smile kind but firm. Jerome, no, Edward. You taught me that sometimes, we need to dream bigger than what we think is possible. On the day Edward departed, the entire community gathered at the schoolyard to see him off. People brought small gifts, hand-knit scarves, drawings from children, and heartfelt words of gratitude. Alice stepped forward, her voice trembling as she addressed Edward, her eyes glistening with tears. Alice, Edward, you brought light to this place. Wherever you go, remember that this will always be your home. Edward stepped forward, his voice steady, yet filled with emotion. Edward, you're not just a community I helped. You're my family. I will carry this place in my heart, always. As Edward's car drove away, Jerome stood watching, his heart swelling with pride and gratitude. He knew that even though Edward was leaving, his legacy would live on not just in the school, but in the spirit of every person in the neighborhood. Seated in the car, Edward glanced back at the neighborhood one last time. A faint smile crossed his lips as he reflected on everything that had happened. In the following months, the story of the school and the neighborhood's transformation spread far and wide. Charitable organizations, journalists, and even community leaders from other areas visited to learn from their success. Jerome, now a symbol of perseverance and unity, continued his work to improve the neighborhood. He organized meetings, rallied for additional resources, and ensured that no family was left behind. As for Edward, upon returning to his family, he began a new chapter. He founded a charity named Hope, dedicated to building sustainable communities, inspired by what he had experienced in the small neighborhood. One evening, Jerome sat on the familiar bench in the schoolyard, gazing at the star-filled sky. The laughter of children and conversations of families filled the air, a melody of fulfillment and happiness. In his hand was a letter from Edward, containing just one short line. Jerome, we've proven that with faith, nothing is impossible. Keep dreaming big, Edward. Jerome smiled as he folded the letter, his eyes glimmering with a sense of purpose. He looked toward the future, knowing that his journey was far from over. Thanks to Edward, he now understood that any dream could become reality, as long as one dared to take the first step. Beneath the night sky, the flame of hope burned brighter than ever, lighting the way for generations to come. This story is not just about the journey of Jerome and Edward. It is a reminder of the power of kindness, unity, and belief in good things. Each character, each moment in the story holds its own meaning, and the rebirth of the small neighborhood symbolizes what we can achieve when we dare to dream big and act tirelessly. We sincerely thank you, our audience, for accompanying this story from beginning to end. Your understanding and sharing are the motivation for stories like this to be told and spread. If this story has sparked even a glimmer of hope, an inspiration, or simply brought a smile to your face, then that is the greatest gift we could ever receive. May you always remember, in every step of life, that change, no matter how small, begins with courage and compassion. Thank you for listening and for becoming a part of this journey.